Now, perhaps there's a slight exaggeration in this analysis, but I doubt if it's much of one. Most people in Britain see difference in many services as bad. Even devolution hasn't dented this idea. Free prescriptions in Scotland and Wales, or differences in student fee regimes, are not seen as evidence of the benefits of difference from country to country within the UK. Rather, they suggest unfairness to people in England. That's the narrative. Now, of course, despite all the efforts of government and public servants, it has proved impossible to deliver a country free of postcode lotteries. The headlines quoted from the national newspapers are often about major differences in NHS provision. Now, here's a quote from the Daily Telegraph from August 2006. It could be from any of these, but I've just taken this one. A postcode lottery in medical treatment, this is a quote, a postcode lottery in medical treatment is flourishing, according to a report today which shows that patients' addresses still determine how much is spent on their care. The King's Fund analysis of primary care trust spending across England raises serious questions about how money is spent, even after adjustments for local needs and conditions. The study for the year 2004-05 found that spending on mental health could be 4 times greater in one PCT than another. For instance, Islington in North London spent £259 per capita on mental health, compared with £66 in Bracknell Forest, Berkshire. And here's another story from the Daily Mail in 2009. Men in some parts of England are almost 5 times more likely to die from prostate cancer than those in other areas, campaigners said yesterday. This again is a quote. In the worst performing constituency, Tottenham, the death rate is 57 per 100,000, while in the best constituency, South East Cambridgeshire, the death rate is 12 per 100,000, nearly 5 times less. The Prostate Cancer Charter for Action, which analysed Office for National Statistics data, said men were suffering from a postcode lottery and parts of the country were not implementing key guidance from the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, unquote. Now, the former article is about resource inputs to health. The latter is about health outcomes. And in any rational world, one might expect more money would need to be spent in some places than in others to deliver equal outcomes. But public opinion, doubtless actively reflected by the press, can't blame them for this, appears to want both equal inputs and equal outcomes. This would be impossible. You cannot have both in a world unless everybody is absolutely the same in every local authority, every constituency, everything, and their needs are exactly the same because the profile of age is exactly the same, and so on. So from these, and literally thousands of other examples, it is possible to establish that we, the public, can't just blame the media for this, can't blame politicians for this, want the eradication of postcode lotteries, even though if we get rid of them in one sphere of policy, i.e. how much we spend per head, it will almost certainly worsen them in other outcomes and outputs. More ominously, it's clear that after 60 years of a national health service, I'm not having a go at the NHS here, but it is over 60 years of a national health service in which, in effect, 100% of the money for the NHS has come directly from national taxation, and with enormously complex resource allocation mechanisms involving massive amounts of work by academics to measure need and allocate cash fairly, and after countless initiatives by ministers to equalise provision and targetry and all of that, the poor old NHS still remains riddled with postcode lotteries. Now, surely we must conclude from this argument that it is literally impossible to be rid of the postcode lottery. Similar analysis of inputs to schools would come up with the same kind of results, as indeed it will in the criminal justice system, which, despite operating under a single set of laws for England and Wales, produces different sentencing policy from court to court within the same towns and cities. We are collectively here chasing a myth. But the title of the talk was "There's nothing to fear from a postcode lottery." So having argued the case in principle against at least some of the implications of the perceived evils of the postcode lottery, or indeed the impossibility of eradicating it. I now want to move on to argue that differences in service levels and provision might actually be, on some occasions at least, a good thing. In the golden age of British local government during the 19th century, the industrialising cities of Britain competed with each other to improve their local services. The Cambridge historian Simon Sretzer has written about this competition and how it raised the standard of services and improved the quality of life for citizens. And here I want to read out a slightly lengthy extract from his work. Forgive me for this, but it's important. And I quote, "During the rest of the 19th century, the new civic gospel," and this is a quote, "of municipal pride and ambitious improvements rippled all over the country from its nonconformist Birmingham epicentre and from the separate centre of municipal innovation in Glasgow in Scotland, which was continually vying with Birmingham for second city status throughout this period. The big businessmen and professionals of other larger cities like Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds began to emulate Birmingham's and Glasgow's successful improvements in a healthy spirit of keen rivalry. By the end of the century, even many smaller and more insular towns, like, forgive me if you come from these, I didn't write this, Wolverhampton, West Bromwich or Wakefield, had followed suit. Cities embarked on programmes to light and pave all their streets, to supply all their homes with plentiful pure water from the hills, to excavate costly arterial sewer systems and connect all the working class houses up to them, at last equipped with WCs and running water. These were all very expensive investments paid for out of rates and taxes, which the electorate previously simply would not stomach. In the proverbial do-nothing ancient parish vestries of Victorian London, even they eventually fell prey to the new spirit of civic government. The results, in terms of poverty and inequality, or social exclusion, as we now call it today, were spectacular. From 1870, national death rates began to fall consistently, decade after decade, including even those of the inner cities. Although the revolutionary expansion in municipal services and the move towards comprehensive public health measures cannot be attributed with the whole of the responsibility for this dramatic and sustained improvement in the lives of the urban poor, it was certainly an essential part of the story. That's the end of the quote. Thus, at a time when local government was free to raise taxes and to introduce new services, municipalities chose, for the greater good of local residents and businesses, to compete to improve provision. It was not a race downwards to make services worse and worse, as you might imagine, and certainly politicians behave today as if that's what local government would do. It was a race upwards, so Birmingham could compete with Glasgow and Manchester with both of them. It was competition to improve public provision. There were no centrally imposed standards and certainly no narrative of expectation in relation to the avoidance of a postcode lottery. And yet, oddly, in contemporary terms, services continued to improve radically. Now, if we roll forward to contemporary times, I think it's possible to examine a recent policy issue which makes a similar point. And here I want to look at the smoking ban. For a number of years, a number of municipalities, notably Liverpool City Council, had lobbied to be given powers to introduce a smoking ban in public places. Central government did not see fit to pass enabling legislation. Then, in 2006, Wales and Scotland, newly devolved, or relatively newly devolved, introduced such bans. Following this experience, the UK government introduced a smoking ban in England in 2007. Now, imagine if in 1997, when the last government took office, it had passed legislation allowing councils at their discretion to introduce local smoking bans. Some local authorities would have done so immediately. Others would have made no change. But there would have been an immediate opportunity to see how a ban would work, an experiment. Almost certainly, anti-ban councils would have visited Liverpool and other early adopters to see how things were going. Some of the authorities that originally held out against a ban would then have seen the evidence about the impact on pubs, clubs, local economy more generally, and would have reassessed their opposition. They might even, with luck, have looked at the public health impacts. By 2007, it's likely that only a minority of authorities would still have allowed smoking in many public places. More people would have been healthy than would have been in this world than there was without these local bans being implemented. By 2007, the government could have decided whether or not, on the basis of the evidence from all the places that had smoking bans, if it wanted to go for a national ban on smoking in public places. Now, why can't we have more such experimentation and inter-area competition along these lines? It's true that from 1997 to 2007, there would have been a postcode lottery in terms of, depending on how you see it, smoke-free public buildings or the liberty to smoke in public. That would have been a postcode lottery. But it would have been experimentation and it would have led to public health improvement. Postcode lotteries can, I would argue, on occasion be a good thing. But if we are so obsessed with uniformity in England, then such local policy variations are almost impossible to contemplate. And no wonder British politicians spend so much time on jets to and from America looking at examples of experimentation in public services, because they have to go there because there, for good or for ill, there is an enormous amount of experimentation. Now, of course, the smoking ban is only one example, in this case related to public health, though if I can add a footnote, I think this kind of action for public health would lead to huge improvements if there were this kind of experimentation at the local level, rather than everything being done nationally. And we are going to see more local public health provision on the changes the government's making. But this is only one example of how difference could be positive, difference between place could be positive. Of course, it does not of itself suggest a postcode lottery would be a good thing, and nor do I believe postcode lotteries are, even despite all I've said, a good thing. Those who oppose the postcode lottery, who want to stamp them out, have laudable and benign objectives. No one wants to see palpable unfairness in the kind of services available to people simply as a result of the area in which they live or their personal circumstances or anything else that is outside their own control. On the other hand, an unthought-through attempt to stamp out all postcode lotteries wherever they emerge leads to inconsistent expectations on the part of the public, i.e., the desire for exactly the same levels of spending per head and exactly the same levels of outcomes for very different populations. It will also create a risk of a vast panoply of detailed, centrally imposed targets, heavy regulation, and intrusive auditing. And the result, and this was tested very heavily by the last government, will be the risk of every public service being seen permanently to fail. That is the risk of going down that route. So to conclude, I would suggest that there is nothing to be feared from difference, experimentation, and innovation within local areas. Variations in local services can be positive evidence of efforts to improve public provision, and most certainly would not or should not be seen necessarily as the starting point for concern about a new postcode lottery. No one would, as I've said, advocate implausible differences in the prescription of drugs, in access to childcare, or in sentencing policy. But efforts to remove all differences in spending per head, inputs, outputs, and outcomes will be doomed to failure. Instead, we should reinforce a presumption that public services should always improve everywhere, and we should stimulate competition between local providers, particularly councils, to drive up standards compared with other areas, and we should look enthusiastically upon experiments, even the ones that fail. If we do all of this, then we will indeed have nothing to fear from a postcode lottery. Thank you very much.